Excellent. So thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Shelley Coles, who is the ASD lead practitioner at Cambridge School, London. And she's going to talk about autism and educational neuroscience. It's an area that I'm sure that we all in our class are particularly interested in. So thank you very much. Over to you, Shelley.
Right. I'm just trying to go into slideshow, and here we are. Right, hello everyone. Oh, yeah, the baby's been taken away, so the main entertainment's gone, I'm sorry. So I've just been introduced as the autism lead practitioner at Cambridge School, which is a special needs school. But really, I think, which is relevant enough, really, I think more relevant might be my job before, where I was running the autism unit in a mainstream school, because I imagine if you're a drama specialist, a lot of you will work in mainstream schools, but have a couple of autistic individuals in your class. So I've got some experience helping people with that if they're not autism specialists. Before that, I was just a normal mainstream person, and I spent 15 years being an A-level psychology person and talking about boring stuff like passing exams, which didn't lend itself very well to the care of special needs students. I'm sure a lot of you have come across that issue as well. So that's me, and I'm going to check that. And oh good, animations work in this PowerPoint. It was originally billed as Autism in the Classroom, Educational Neuroscience and Bridging the Gap. I renamed it and said I've called it Autism in the Autistic Brain, mostly because of this book that I love, that if you're interested you should read as well, by someone amazing called Temple Grandin. I'm hovering my mouse over it if you can see it. Temple Grandin's incredible. She's an autistic woman who was almost she barely spoke until she was about 10, 12, 14. It came in dribs and drabs. She's now she works in agriculture and designs farming systems, but she's also an academic who's done loads and loads of work on advocacy and has written an amazing book about the differences seen in autistic people's brains. And it got me into autism, and it got me out of mainstream and into work with autistic young people, because it was just so interesting looking at the biological differences and social differences for autistic people. So that's the autistic brain bit of it. And I'm just finishing up my Masters in Educational Neuroscience and spend a lot of time talking about brains, which is why there's a picture of a brain on the screen at the moment. Now we need to talk about why autism, because we're here to talk about SEN generally. There's a couple answers. Firstly, autism is becoming more and more, well, if not autism, autism diagnosis is becoming more and more common. There's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll come on to later, but you're more and more likely to have an autistic child in your classroom than ever before, or at least a child with a diagnosis. Also, a lot of the issues that will be touched upon in this session are going to be experienced by a lot of children, whether or not they have an autism diagnosis. There are a lot of things that autistic young people experience because it's such a varied condition. You may well pick up something useful that helps with a child who has a different condition, but that's the joy of autism. There are just so many issues that pop up that you might pick something useful up that works with other children. And sort of related to that, autism best practice is pretty much just best practice. You know, if you are communicating well and explaining changes clearly and making sure that all of your students understand things and are happy, that's pretty good practice anyway. So it's a useful area to look at. So also you can probably hear I've got my little backing singer, which is great. I'll just try and shout. So I'm assuming that, or you can just go and dance in the other room. I'm sure everyone enjoys hearing babies singing. So I'm assuming some people here know very little about autism. If you already know a lot, then I'm sorry, you may just, hear a few things that you're already familiar with. But if you're not sure about autism, it's very common. It affects social functioning and sensory perception, and I've got on the PowerPoint, it results in fixed patterns of behavior, because that's part of the diagnostic criteria. Related to that is a stereotype where people think that autistic people can't cope with change. And I've heard teachers say, oh no, there's a change coming, my autistic kid won't know what to do. And I'm quite opposed to that way of thinking, because change happens and anyone can and will cope eventually, but I think it's really important to help plan for change and explain change. I've had lots of autistic students who I've been told won't cope with this change or can't cope and whatever, but actually if we know it's coming and we explain why, and we explain the things that are going to stay the same and how things might change, it doesn't have to be that painful. But obviously when you're a busy teacher, there's change that hits you that you aren't even ready for yourself. It's hard to prepare your students for all the various changes that we get. This is onslaught that we have to cope with ourselves. But as much as we can filter that for our autistic students, it helps them. Another thing you might not be aware of, so at the moment, or from 2013, we've been talking about children with autistic spectrum disorder. That's the diagnosis that a child with autism will have from 2013. The DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, Volume 5, changed quite a lot in 2013. Before that, it covered 4 separate disorders. A child might have a diagnosis of autistic disorder, Asperger disorder, childhood disintegrative disorder, very wordy, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. It's messy, which means that if you look at children's EHCPs, their education healthcare plans or pupil profiles, you might see them described in all sorts of ways, just depending on when they got their diagnosis. Just be mindful of that, and don't be embarrassed if you've never heard of something, because who knows when it was written. I've even seen things on EHCPs that weren't ever a diagnosis. People sort of cobble a bunch of words together, and everyone's just trying to make sense of the many words, but you're fine. She could sit on me, Chris. Oh. On that, I'm going to talk a bit about language and how people describe our autistic community. It's surprisingly easy to offend. There was a wonderful study done a couple of years ago where autistic people were interviewed along with their families and friends and professionals who work with them, their clinicians, their teachers, and they were just asking how it's best to speak to and about autistic people. And there's this huge range of opinion, there's loads of debate. So as NTs, as neurotypicals, people with typically developing brains and behaviors, it can be a bit of a minefield. So I think it's quite useful to talk you through some of the things that came out in this study. One thing that was really interesting was a lot of the people who completed the survey were Aspies, so they had an Asperger's diagnosis before it got lumped in with autism spectrum disorder, and they really clung to their Aspie identity, and that's quite a big theme you'll see if you follow any autistic online communities, and there's quite a lot of kind of resistance from some people who had an older Asperger's diagnosis, in our a lot of people have asked, why have all these conditions been lumped together? Just be mindful, especially with your older autistic students, that they might not recognize themselves as autistic. They might say they're an Aspie or anything else, you know, depending on what they've been told when they were younger. Another interesting term that came up was non-verbal, used to describe autistic people who don't speak much, but it's better really to say minimally verbal, because somebody might say, an autistic person who's still developing their verbal speech, they might say a couple of words, they might make a few speech sounds, they might not be as verbally articulate as the Asperger's child with the same diagnosis, but non-verbal makes it sound like they'll never learn to speak. And the truth is, you know, sooner or later, you know, communication will improve, and there's always scope for improvement. So it's just far safer to describe someone as minimally verbal than non-verbal. There's also loads of debate around the terms high and low functioning. You might hear children described as high functioning. That's pretty common. So you might hear there's a child coming into your class who is very verbally articulate. They have autism, but they can speak really well, and they can join in social activities, and they can tie their own shoelaces and do all sorts of things. So they're very, very high functioning. Don't think of them as disabled, think of them as normal. And, you know, that all sounds great when you're thinking about that child, but the kind of flip side is, well, you know, that means they're a low functioning children, and it probably makes them feel awful hearing themselves described like that. Or, you know, if they put together and go, oh, if they're high functioning, I'm low functioning. It's and also, you know, there's a few other things we'll touch on that suggest that even children who are low functioning, I'm doing the inverted commas, they are low functioning, they're not very independent at the moment or very good at communicating at the moment, but actually they've got a lot going on that they aren't communicating or yet, and it's probably very insulting for them to be hearing themselves described as low functioning when they're actually very capable. Just, it's a minefield out there, just lots of things to look out for as you're meeting your students and hearing other professionals talk about them. We all mean well, but it's really easy to say the wrong thing. And it's just something to try and get the hang of over the years. Other interesting terms that came up in this study that I found fascinating. There's a debate about whether you should describe somebody as a person with autism or an autistic person. It sounds really silly. It sounds really pedantic, but it's found a lot of professionals, a lot of clinicians thought it was less offensive to say person with autism, because that means they are a person in their own right, plus an autism diagnosis, and the autism doesn't have to determine their identity and who they are. And that sounds great. So a person with autism just makes them like, okay, I'm a person, I have a condition. And actually, when lots of the autistic people interviewed responded to the same question, they said they preferred autistic person. They said they wanted the word autism to be first, because it is part of their identity, and they've grown up knowing they're autistic in most cases, and it's okay to call me an autistic person or an autist. It's safest, really, just as much as you're comfortable, just ask your autistic students what they want to be called, or if they're comfortable, it might be useful to speak to other teachers or speak to their parents and ask, you know, what do they say about themselves, or do they talk about the word autism at all? I had a young lady who we weren't allowed to say the A word. She was really, really verbally articulate, and she clung to her Aspie diagnosis. She was happy to be described as Asperger's, but she wouldn't describe herself as autistic. And for a year, she refused to come and speak to me because she knew I ran the autism support unit, and that would associate her with all the autistic people, and she definitely wasn't autistic, even though she had lots of social difficulty and sensory difficulty, which meant that she, you know, would have benefited from some of the kind of interventions and things we ran, but she didn't want to be associated with it. And it took a long time for her to accept any kind of work with the autism unit, but we had to phrase it. She had to do a special intervention for Asperger's disorder symptomology, which sounded very posh and didn't sound like all the other autistic children. So the point there is different young people will have different views about how they want to be referred to. Some of them might not have been told they have an autism diagnosis. They might have been told they have a superpower. We had a young lady who was told she just had special skills where, you know, she had an amazing memory and she was really good at art, but her superpower of art and memory kind of sapped her math skills, and that was just how it was explained to her. And you know, that was fine, we just worked with it. So it's all about just getting to know your students and not assuming that they'll all have the same issues because they're all autistic if you have a number of autistic students. A few other things that I found really interesting with the online autism community. Rainbows are used as a symbol of autism on a lot of autism websites. The idea is, you know, it's a spectrum, there are lots of different colours to show the diversity within the autism community. There are some websites that use a jigsaw piece to show, to represent autism and to show the many pieces of a puzzle all coming together. But there's been a bit of a backlash in the last sort of 5 or 10 years where autistic people online have now said, well, that suggests that there are missing bits or there might be wrong bits and it's a bit offensive. Again, it's something that it's sad because some people have really clung to that as a part of their identity and other people have found that upsetting. It's all about getting to know the students, the individuals. One other sort of final point on that, a really big development with the autism community online in the last probably 5 years or a bit longer is the word neurodiversity. It's really kicked off. If you hear an autistic person talk about neurodiversity, or anyone talk about neurodiversity, it's just the idea that our brains are all developing differently. The autistic people's brains might be developing differently to a neurotypical brain. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with either brain. It's just there is diversity. We have different ways of looking at the world. We have different ways of interpreting and experiencing things. It doesn't mean necessarily there's anything wrong. So that's quite a nice word. Oh, and I've also been reminded to mention, you might see ASD, you'll probably see ASD written somewhere on a child's diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder. But the word disorder is also arguably a problem. If a child is doing well and is happy and healthy, why call it a disorder? So it's also quite common now to refer to someone with that diagnosis as having ASC, as an autism spectrum condition. Again, I'll probably say ASD a lot because it's habit, but just be aware there are so many different ways of describing and referring to autistic people. I will almost certainly say something offensive or something you haven't heard of or something that you've been told shouldn't be said because I've probably heard something wrong over the years. It's quite a fast moving sort of community. So enough of that. One thing that you should keep in mind is the diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. I believe it's a number of different spectrums. It's a number of different issues that you might see with your students. I think a lot about my past students with this kind of idea. I'm thinking about a group of students I had a couple of years ago, all with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. We had Naima, who was loud and vivacious and socially confident, and too socially confident. She might be quite wild and uncontrollable and hilarious, and say quite inappropriate things. And I wish I could tell you some of the things she said, but they're really, really offensive. But I found it hilarious. And she was the same age and had the same diagnosis as Alice, who was in the same class as her, and was incredibly shy and didn't want to say much and didn't want to offend anyone and was mortified at the idea of offending anyone or saying the wrong thing. So she chose not to say much at all. But they were often sat next to each other in the same class because they both had autism, so they must be the same and they must be friends. And the truth is they couldn't stand each other. Naima thought Alice was boring and Alice thought Naima was terrifying. So they're a very varied community. Also in the same school but in different classes, we had Ada, who was insistent that she had to move the whole time and got in a lot of trouble with her teachers for moving, and she would shake if she wasn't allowed out of her chair or wasn't allowed to tap her foot. She would sort of, her whole body would start to shake because for her movement was a really big deal. It was very sad if she wasn't allowed to tap her foot, because that was something advised by her occupational therapist to help her cope with the frustration of sitting still. And she'd get very angry at Cynthia, who needed to hear noise and needed to hear crunching sounds. And she was given carrots to crunch or crisps to crunch during a lesson so that she could block out other distracting sounds. It was her way of focusing on one thing rather than processing all the different noises. They're all so different. They've all got the same diagnosis. So I view autism as a number of different spectrums. They might be very fixed or actually have loads of different interests. There might be lots of social confidence or social anxiety. There might be a love of structure and patterns. There might be serious learning difficulty or absolutely no learning difficulty. There might be strong language skills. There might be too much speech in Naima's case, or really early development of language skills, or sorry, late development of language skills. There might be wonderful emotional regulation and incredible calmness and control, or there might be an awful lot of emotional outburst and upset and difficulty with emotional regulation. And there might be a lot of hypersensitivity, so being oversensitive to environment, and that might be sight, sound, smell, touch, temperature, all sorts. And there might be hyposensitive autistic children, so they might be undersensitive and seek sensory experiences. So we had a little girl who would run into the room and touch everything and grab everything and lick everything. And there's a boy at my current school who does the same. He licks things all the time because he wants to experience things. And, you know, which is obviously difficult now with COVID. You know, we had to work quite hard on telling him not to lick the tables all the time. So there's a huge range of behaviours you're going to see amongst the children with the same diagnosis. A few words on learning difficulties, because this is obviously our interest as teachers, and we've got to get information into their heads. So about a fifth, it varies a lot depending on measurement, about a fifth of people with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis will have a learning difficulty, at least listed on their EHCP, but don't underestimate them because you see that on an EHCP or on a pupil profile sheet. The measurement really determines how intelligent they'll look on paper. There's a huge range of performance from autistic people in terms of their learning abilities. There are two different intelligence tests called Raven's Progressive Matrices and Wechsler Intelligence Test. Wechsler's more traditional IQ score test, and Raven's is more suited to children without the same verbal abilities. What's amazing is autistic children do so differently. There's such a range of performance on these two different intelligence tests, showing that the test you use with an autistic child kind of affects how clever they'll look on paper. They might come out as very, very high functioning on one end and not on the other. Or with one test and not with the other. What's interesting is with typically developing children, so with neurotypical brains, you don't get that same range depending on the test. So just be conscious that your autistic children might have a serious learning difficulty, or they might have been tested using something that wasn't appropriate for their learning abilities. So to sum that bit up, they're very diverse. Don't underestimate your autistic children. Also don't overestimate, don't assume that they're going to be okay with something just because you think, oh great, I've got an autistic child, they're going to love music and maths. They're just all going to be so different. I was asked quite often at my previous school, where I worked in a mainstream school but running the autism support, I was asked, you know, by class teachers, I've got an autistic student, what do I do with them? And especially when I was new in the post, I'd only been there a month or a week, and I was like, well, have you asked their other teachers who actually know them, or their families, or have you kind of watched them a bit in your class? I mean, I'll come and watch them with you, but really, you know, there just aren't kind of coverall statements and strategies. It's all about getting to know our students. You've probably heard of some famous autistic people like Chris Packham and Greta Thunberg, and my favorite, Temple Grandin. Again, they're quite a specific group of autistic people. They're all very good with animals and environmental issues, very verbally articulate, very good at campaigning. But the autistic people you meet in your classrooms are going to be very, very different to each other and to the famous autistic people. I always think about how different Alice and Naima were, who I just mentioned. I've got some other amazing students who, again, I find very different. I've got Marcus and Bobby. Marcus will, he really doesn't like lots of noise, and Bobby needs to make lots of noise. Having them in the same classroom where one wants to shout and one wants quiet, it's difficult, and it's just something that as a school staff team, there aren't quick fixes. It's arguably, you know, maybe wrong, if not impossible, to ask one student who needs to be loud to be quiet, or ask a student who needs quiet to put up with the noise. So it might just mean relocating one or both, or choosing activities really carefully to preempt any conflict or distress that's going to come up. I've got another student here, his name Ryan, just thinking about not overestimating our students socially. And just be aware that students will hide a lot of difficulties. I've just put Ryan here to remind myself that getting to know your students really can prevent conflict and difficult behaviour. I remember this student getting told off quite harshly because he hadn't said good morning. A member of staff had said, "Good morning, Ryan," and he kind of, you know, looked around in all different directions and except the person's face, because he found eye contact quite uncomfortable, and didn't say good morning back and kind of scuttled off, and then was told off for being rude. And the problem is, we'll see that a lot with our autistic students. They're not going to comply immediately if they find something very, very difficult. Ryan is really intelligent and really socially aware and really, really keen to say hello to people he likes, or people he knows. But at that moment, he came across as really rude, and I think was labelled from that point with that member of staff as that rude, difficult child. And it's just something to keep in mind with our autistic students. There's amazing stuff going on with them, but we might not be aware at first. And he makes me think a lot of a young man called Ido Kedar, who wrote an incredible book. Please find this book. I should have shared a link. Ido was minimally verbal, or didn't speak until well, I think even now, I don't think he speaks verbally, but he's now learned to speak using a computer program and a special device. I won't try and get into the technology of it, it's beyond me, but he now types or uses symbols to communicate. But using that system, he's written a whole book, which is amazing. Ido talked about how frustrated he was being in a clinician's office and hating hearing his parents talking about his difficulties and being unable to speak and comment himself on his own condition. He describes his condition as an output disorder. He says he's got an intact mind, there's lots going on in his head, but he just couldn't get it out. He couldn't make the words come up through his voice box and out through his lips. And yet he was understanding everything that people were saying about him, and he was insulted or annoyed or embarrassed, but he just couldn't express it until he somehow got this amazing book out. I think it was published in 2017. But he talks about being in this clinician's office and hating it and trying to show how awkward he felt by standing by the window, looking out the window and staring at their car and pointing at the car. And he was trying to show his parents, I want to go. I hate this. I want to get out. This is horrible. Let's go in the car and go. And he heard his parents and then a clinician say, oh, he loves cars. Look at him showing us how much he loves cars. And was obviously infuriated and had a big tantrum. And they said, oh, now he's having a meltdown. Look at him trashing the place. And it was just because he couldn't get out all the things that were in his head. So it's a reminder that even your students, if you have very, very minimally verbal students who really struggle to communicate and they're trashing the place and they're throwing things at you. I've had a lot of big items and chairs and whatever thrown at me. Even if you have chairs flying at your head and somebody's not saying the right thing at all, it doesn't mean there's not a lot going on in there. It's just unlocking, which could be the difficulty. So a few other things you may not be aware of. I'll try and do a bit of myth busting. Autism isn't just a boy thing, it's just overdiagnosed in boys. It's very likely with your female autistic students, there's a bit more camouflaging. From a young age, girls are told to read books, so they learn more words. Girls are told to sit and talk and play nicely, whereas boys are allowed to go and play with toy cars and footballs. So girls tend to pick up more verbal skills. It doesn't mean the autism isn't there, but the girls might be a little better at hiding social difficulties. But and I had a lovely student a couple of years ago called Lilith, who talked at great length about how exhausting it was. As soon as she left my office and had to go out into the rest of the school and interact with other students, she was exhausted because so as soon as she came into my office, she'd tell me how exhausted she was, because it's really tiring pretending to be comfortable around other people. And she would sort of sit around and cry and say how hard it was just pretending to be normal. So it's not just the boys who suffer with autism. It's not just a Western phenomenon. We imagine, I think the stereotype is a geeky white boy with glasses, if you think about an autistic child. But there's a lot of increase in diagnosis among certain communities. There's been a lot of work done looking at the Somali community. There's quite an over-diagnosis rate in the Somali community that's being studied at the moment. It could be to do with social differences in those cases. There's a whole wealth of research looking at why that is, because there isn't, you know, a genetic difference saying, oh, you've got an ethnic minority who's going to be more prone, but it could link to the social kind of diagnostic criteria in discrepancies that lead to overdiagnosis in some groups. But just a reminder, it varies a lot and it's not all just white boys with glasses. There's a lot of comorbidity, as in one condition being diagnosed at the same time or before or after another condition. So a lot of autistic children will also be diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or pathological demand avoidance or oppositional defiance disorder or I'm sorry, the things in the way of the screen, I can't see all the various acronyms. You can ask later if I've missed something. Conduct disorder, high callous unemotional traits, sensory processing disorder. There's so many different things that get blended in, and in some cases clinicians have sort of admitted, sounds like it's really bad, if they're not sure, they'll give an autism diagnosis just to make sure that there is a definite diagnosis and the child can access some help. That doesn't happen all the time, but it's likely because it's such a difficult condition to diagnose, and it is often co-occurring with other conditions. Also, a lot of people will hear might have heard of this sort of phrase, we've all got a little bit of autism, or we're all a little bit up the spectrum. It's a really interesting concept, and I think it's helpful because most of us have some kind of trait. Most of us might be oversensitive to something or have some kind of difficulty or or a sort of special skill, or that all of us might have a trait here or there. But it's important to keep in mind that there are differences at a neural level. There are differences in the brains of diagnosed autistic people. And a lot of people with an autism diagnosis find it a little bit frustrating, or to hear that all the neurotypicals are kind of getting in on the action. You know, there are autistic people who would say we shouldn't try and lump everyone together, because there are certain difficulties that come with autism that can't be sort of lumped with everyone else. There is a distinct difference with having autism. But again, on that, brains, I did promise some pictures of brains, and also a few myths. I think you can't talk about autistic brains unless you have an idea of brains normally. So I've got to do a bit of myth busting. There are special regions in the brain, that, you know, special areas that do jobs, but that changes over time. They're not fixed areas. All brains have the same organs and items on each side. You do not get left and right brain people. This angers me so much when I hear people talk about left and right brains, because they don't exist. If you look at the picture in the bottom left corner, from above, brains are two identical organs squashed together, well, squashed, connected by a channel called the corpus callosum, but you don't get left and right brains. There are some regions, there are some regional differences. For example, there's a lot of language use that's seen more on the left side. There's an area on the left side of the brain called Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which is used a bit more on the left side for language processing. But again, that doesn't mean that you can be left-brained. The same things will take place on both sides. If that area is damaged, other nearby areas can accommodate and take on those functions. So you don't get left and right-brained people. If you ever hear someone talk about being left-brained and right-brained, tell them from me that they're a very bad word. I was going to say horrible things. Tell them that they're silly, and that they need to read more about brains. Also, just a few other things. We have completely the same structure and layout brain as other animals, right down to insects. It's just that we have big cerebral cortexes, the area along the top, for kind of holding and processing lots of memories and information. Boys and girls' brains are the same. They have all the same organs and parts and areas and regions. Any differences are through experience. We're all born with the same bits of our brains. If you look at adult male and female brains, they'll be different. More male brains might have kind of visuospatial skill. I won't stop worrying with different regions, but we might see a bit more activity in areas to do with map reading in boys and language skills in girls. You will see that, but that's all through practice. That's all because those areas are used more. Language areas might be used more because little girls are told to read more when they're tiny. It's not that anyone was born with a different type of brain. And my favorite and most important thing, there are not learning styles. Brains all use and do and need different things at different times. If a child, you know, feels a bit more comfortable reading something rather than looking at pictures or doing a cartwheel while they learn it or whatever, it doesn't mean that they are more verbal or visual or kinesthetic. There are habits that we pick up and preferences, but it's quite dangerous to label a child as, oh, they're very kinesthetic or very visual, because actually we all need a little bit of everything. And certain activities, I mean, especially you guys as drama people, you're going to be doing this huge range of activities, and all of the different types of learning are going to be relevant at different times. And if a kid says, oh, I'm not kinesthetic, I'm visual, don't get me to do this piece of physical theatre, I need a picture, that might be their preference, but it's certainly not what their brain is forcing them into. So the most important bit, really, autistic brains. Now we've got an idea of general brains. There are so many differences. I won't try and talk through all the different regions and bits and acronyms here because I'd frazzle your brain, but you can look at that picture at your leisure later. The key things to keep in mind, autistic brains are different. There are regions that are activated differently in autistic people. So it's not fair to say we're all a little bit autistic. But also there will be regional differences amongst autistic people. So this links up to what we said earlier on. Our autistic children won't all have the same brain differences. They won't all have the same behaviors because their brains are the same as each other. They are just like us neurotypicals, assuming we're all neurotypical here, are responsive to environments. So any brain, autistic or not, will develop and learn and adapt through experience. So it's never okay to write off any of our young people and say, oh, this is how they are. They respond, there are some really interesting early differences seen. Autistic children respond differently to social stimuli. So maybe like a footage of a person talking. From as young as 4 months old, there's been amazing neuroimaging studies of tiny children, tiny babies, and they already use different parts of their brain or have reduced activation when studying or looking at, oh thanks, my baby's trying to join in. She's telling us that when she was 4 months old, her brain was already responding to social stimulus, or not if she turns out to be autistic, we don't know. Another difference, there is reduced or atypical connectivity in a lot of autistic brains. So that doesn't mean that the same information isn't shared or present or stored in an autistic brain, but the connections might be different. It means that an autistic person might not leap to the same conclusions that their neurotypical peers will. They might not make the same kind of leaps. If a teacher suggests something without making it explicit, they might not put the pieces together because they haven't made that connection. And there is a physical reason for that. The regions aren't communicating in the same ways. They might be arranged differently. Again, the brain's still working. It's just that the connections might not have been made. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to talk very quickly through this last bit about ASD rising, and I might ask you to just read over this a bit later. Be mindful that this presentation is important because you will see lots of autistic students in your class through the next few years. This could be to do with brain development. There is a theory saying that as more premature babies survive, they might have survived but struggle more with neural development that they would have had in the last few weeks of pregnancy. The social theories, I think, are more likely. We could say autism is becoming more common because children are learning social skills less or differently in their early life, because we've all seen it, they're all more attached, we're all more attached to our phones and media and technology, and just have less social practice. Another social theory is just that there's more awareness and interest in ASD, meaning that people spot it more in schools, and staff and children, clinicians, everyone's spotting it more, so it's just getting diagnosed more. And then also there's been some research looking at uncertainty with special educational needs, and it's the most common diagnosis if a clinician is not to diagnose someone with. It doesn't mean they don't have autism, but it might be that there are some other conditions, or they're not quite hitting all the diagnostic criteria, but they'll get that diagnosis anyway just to make sure that they get some help. I'm conscious I'm going really quickly now because I'm supposed to save some time for comments and questions. So apologise for my incredibly fast speech. So things for you to think about when you go back to your own classroom and try and remember all of this. All behaviour is communication, meaning whatever your child is doing, it's a way of communicating something that they're feeling or thinking. If a child throws a chair at you, it's not just they wanted to throw a chair at you. They might be communicating some frustration, or that they're interested in seeing how far the chair goes, but there's something behind it. It's never just a random chair thrown. I've already talked about Ryan. It's really easy for children to be labelled as rude or naughty when actually there's something behind that behaviour, and it might not be getting communicated very well yet. It's not a deliberate act of weirdness to be autistic. A lot of teachers and sometimes parents or other children think an autistic child might be pretending or choosing to act strange. They've probably got some real difficulties that are causing those behaviours, but we just don't know. Also, even trying to act normal can make weird stuff happen. Had a lovely girl called Amelia who wanted to act normal and seem normal and be normal, so she'd start telling these elaborate lies and fictions. It was amazing. She told us all sorts of strange things about going on holiday and meeting all these amazing people on holiday, because she thought it sounded normal to go on holiday and meet people, and it turned out she hadn't been anywhere that year, and it was just a very sad attempt at looking normal. Again, it's not deliberate. She's not trying to be a horrible liar. It's just really difficult figuring out the right things to say in social situations. And also emotional regulation is a real difficulty for a lot of our autistic people. Having a meltdown, as it's often called, or having an outburst, or however we refer to it, getting really upset or angry isn't deliberate. It's a genuine difficulty. If we look back at our pictures of brains in great detail, we'll spot a lot of different connectivity in the emotional regulation regions of the brain. It is a genuine difficulty to control emotions for a lot of autistic people. So things for you to do as wonderful practitioners: support your students with planning and organisation, and prepare for change. Because of differences in connectivity, they might not have picked up that something's coming, that something's going to happen, or that it's going to be the same as it was this time last week. It needs to be made explicit. Personalize, get to know your students' individual strategies, and allow them, if they've been recommended by a clinician or professional, even if it goes against normal classroom routines, you might have to be a little bit flexible. If necessary for your autistic students, create a low arousal environment, nothing too exciting or stimulating, again, depending on the needs of your students. Other students might need to be alerted and given activities to pick them up. Really importantly, teach social understanding explicitly, because it's not obvious to our autistic students. It's not obvious what we should say or do in certain situations. And the same thing with emotional regulation. You might need to tell your autistic child, this is how you calm yourself down. Focus on whatever the happy thing is. Take a deep breath, go and walk outside. Label your emotion as anger and not upset, or it depends on what the child's experiencing, but it needs to be taught. It won't be picked up implicitly necessarily. And then last thing I'm going to rattle through in about 1 minute, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions, is probably the most important thing. I know I'm speaking to drama people, so just a few things to point out specifically for those in drama classrooms. So the first thing, a lot of autistic children and other children, and probably other professionals in your school, might think of a drama classroom as a very noisy, scary place. And it might not be, but that will be how it's viewed by a lot of children or non-drama people. But you can understand with autistic children why they might be worried, because there are lots of different routines in a drama classroom. There might be a difference in structure. So an autistic child might be worrying as they come in, are we going to do stuff in groups today? How am I going to find a partner? What if no one's going to be my partner? Or there's no desks. Where am I supposed to stand? In my other classroom, in my other classes, we go and stand by our desk and we get our pencil cases out, but there's no desk. There's no seating plan. The teachers just told me to go and take off my shoes, but I didn't have to do that in science. So there are lots of differences in drama classes or with certainly sort of practical activities that they just won't have come across. Most students figure out really quickly that this is just something special in a drama classroom, but a lot of autistic children might not figure it out as quickly and just need to be reassured or have things explained where you assume they'd be fine, they just might not be. Remember Naima, my loud, wild girl, loved drama. She loved bouncing around and thought it was an opportunity to shout and scream, even if that wasn't the right thing to do. Whereas Alice really didn't want to ever do that. So it just depends on your individual students' needs and preferences. So they might love or hate drama. Again, just get to know them. Just to be aware, to make it very explicit, the normal school routines may or may not apply. You'll have to tell a lot of your students. It might be more difficult if your student's very sensitive. Also, there's an assumption that autistic people might not like drama lessons because they have poor theory of mind. It is true that autistic people struggle with perspective taking and picturing the thoughts of others or understanding the thoughts of others. That is a common difficulty. But you can plan for it. And also a lot of autistic people really love their drama classes because they learn a bit about other behaviors and other people's characters and thoughts and feelings. And it is taught in a way that it wouldn't be taught elsewhere. So it's a wonderful opportunity to help autistic children with theory of mind when otherwise they might not get it. So you're in a really powerful position as a drama person. I've got a list here of things that you can do with an autistic person who's having a tough moment, because it is common to struggle. But I'm not going to read it through because I know we've only got 5 minutes and you've probably got lots of questions or comments. So I'm going to leave that there on the screen and stop talking. And I've rattled through the last few slides and see if anyone's got anything that they want to add or ask. And over to you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that, Shelley. I think the learning style thing is something that's come back, and Wendy's raised that in the chat. I mean, I remember sitting through an AQA training session with the lead moderator for the devising log, and she's, as for the written exam, saying, for your kinesthetic students, you are probably best to prepare the exam in this way, or for your visual students, we as an exam board recommend that. And it's that kind of language. And as Vivienne has said, it doesn't help that the terminology from neuroscience changes, but in many ways, in the same way that we have to be up to date with our own subject knowledge, we should also really be up to date with those changes as well, because again, the discourse becomes important. So if anyone wants to unmute themselves, we've got about 5 minutes to ask any specific questions. Go ahead. I mean, otherwise we'll just listen to Eddie scream about her anger at learning styles for the next 4 minutes.
I'll do that.
So if anyone would like to, so the theory of mind, can you just go back to the slide about the theory of mind?
Ooh, the one just there.
Yeah, that last point.
So Zena, what was your specific question with regards to that?
I can't hear Zena. Oh,
can you hear me?
I can't hear. Sorry, everyone.
It's all right.
So I can hear you. I should be able to hear you now. Sorry, everyone.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can now. That was my bad. I'd turn the volume down on my computer. Sorry. Go again, Zena.
The bit about theory of mind. Oh, it's gone again. There you go. There you go. A considerable disadvantage. The next point. The one after. That's it. Yeah. Right. Unless you accommodate for it. So is that the chunks of now we're doing this, now we're doing that, this is why we're doing this? Or is it the social skills, or is that how their mind works, or knowing how their mind works?
I'm so sorry, I raced through that and it's so important. So theory of mind is is the ability to picture what's in somebody else's mind, or to theorize what might someone else be thinking. So because I have good theory of mind, I can look at that other child shouting and I can theorize that he's pretty angry. Or because I have terrible theory of mind, I might look at that child crying and go, oh, they're having a lovely day. So it's the ability to look at, they're crying with happiness. So it's the ability to look at someone else and figure out what they're thinking or feeling. And it's just a very common, it's not always with autistic people, but it's a very common difficulty where an autistic person might find it hard to understand another person's point of view. What's really, really interesting, there was a study done 10 years ago now, looking at autistic children and children with callous unemotional traits. Sounds horrible, sort of children with all sorts of aggressive and sort of difficult behaviors. And they found that autistic children, and they gave them lots of social situations and stimuli and so on. Autistic children really struggled with theory of mind. So they couldn't understand why, she didn't sit on me, they couldn't understand why somebody might be crying or happy or laughing. They found it hard to piece together the kind of the situational factors. They didn't know that someone losing their glasses might make them cry. So they found it really hard to understand other people's points of view. But critically, they cared. If they were told, you've got, you know, this person's crying because they've lost their glasses, they really felt sad about it, like really sad, and felt sorry for them. So they have a really strong sense of empathy, in some cases too strong. So it's not that they don't care about other people's thoughts or feelings, but they might find it hard to understand. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant.
Yeah, so excellent. There's the final comment here with regards to autistic children being removed from drama lessons because of SLT view or Senko's views that drama might not be for them. And I think what this session has shown is that that must be a discussion that is, again, parents need to be involved. You know, if parents are saying this is my child's favorite lesson, you know, in our school, for instance, we make a policy of it's not from the same lesson. If an intervention is happening, it must rotate around subjects if the support is required. And I would say, with my secondary hat on, the new Ofsted framework frowns on very, very, very much schools that are reducing the curriculum for specific interventions. So if you are looking as an inspector that this pupil is being removed for literacy support or their specific, you know, sessions that are mandated in their HCP, but it's coming from drama, which means they don't get a drama lesson, or it's coming from a specific thing, that is counted as a narrowing of the curriculum. So that is an important thing that now, as Amanda Spielman said in the select committee the other day, you know, inspections are going back full whack in September. So I think, you know, that is something to go back and be empowered when talking to schools, because end of the day, most timetablers don't care if it comes out of what subject, but they will care about the idea that, you know, Ofsted frowns on this. So, you know, sometimes we can use the O word, you know, quite effectively. I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to do a massive round of applause for Shelley. Thank you, Eddie. Absolutely. I'm going to stop the session now. We're going to be 2 or 3 minutes delayed starting the next one. But yes, please grab a coffee or something and have a lovely, lovely